Bishop Epcorn, do you have another story to tell, or are you okay? Could we start? Okay. Dave's been at every meeting telling some stories, but it's been interesting. Sorry, I'm late a little bit. Hi, John. Good to see you up and about. We've had some great meetings today, I take it. You guys have worked with some people today. This is now our opportunity to weigh in. Is that what's going to happen here today, or something like that? So I was at a meeting earlier today, and Nicole kind of showed me what was smart growth and what was dumb growth. So it was kind of nice to see that now we're starting to get criteria, what we want to incentivize and what might be good for the community. And it is different when you finally start putting markers and different measures to that. And I think sometimes as a city, you want to incentivize growth no matter how that is. And now you're beginning, maybe there's certain growth that we want to have different than other areas in our community. And I think that as a commission, we've always tried to struggle with that, is what is important and where do you want to go. And I always like the term smart growth. That came along before smartphones, but the idea that we're going to grow in a smart fashion is what we've had our planning department to come up with. And it's always those kind of criteria that you have to have the discipline to stay to it, right? I mean, if we come up with a great idea, then we as a commission have to endorse that and enforce that. And I think that's the next task, right? And more what we're finishing with, what we're going through with Land Development Code is what that smart growth would be and what your quote recommendations would be. Is that correct? Okay. Nicole, are you going to take this off, or our consultants?
Did you want to kick us off at all? Yeah, hello, my name is Nicole Crutchfield. I'm with the Planning Department, and thank you so much, Planning Commission, City Commission, for the joint opportunity to meet as we start to get into the nitty-gritty, or not quite at the nitty-gritty level, but at the big concept level that will help inform the nitty-gritty level of the Land Development Code. So this morning, the CZB team are here for a few days, and this morning we have Pete will talk about this, but we had a couple of task force, we had our staff technical meeting this morning, and then tomorrow we have a whole host of meetings, and then tonight we also have a meeting with the neighborhoods. And so lots of opportunities for engagement, but we're all receiving the same information, maybe in slightly different ways, but some interesting opportunities to provide input on what we're thinking. And so there's no conversation or question that's a bad one. Please participate, as don't feel like you've missed anything. I'm looking at our newest planning commissioner. In terms of backstory or anything, there's no wrong place to start in the conversation. And so I thought we should do a round of introduction, since we do have some, maybe you did this already, but some newer commissioners, and I'll pass it to my right.
Dave Hepcorn, Fargo City Commission.
Brett Shuey on Planning Commission.
John Strand, City Commission.
Miranda Tassa, Planning Commission.
Amy Haas, Planning Commission.
Michael Batlock, Planning Commission.
Paul Dye, Planning Commission.
Tracy Georgery, Planning Commission.
Denise Kolpak, City Commission.
Tim Mahoney, Mayor.
Thomas Eddington, CZB.
Matt Ingles, CZB.
Pete Lombardi, CZB.
Christy Dodson, Code Studio.
Kim Satrowski, Fargo Planning.
Mark Williams, Fargo Planning.
And I'll toss it over to Kim or Pete to kick us off. We have about maybe 10 minutes of presentation, but lots of time for conversation as well.
Yep, that's right. No, thanks, Nicole. And thanks for having us here today at this joint meeting. What we'll do is do just some quick project updates so everyone is on the same page in terms of where we are in this LDC update project. We'll do a very quick overview of key issues that came up from our first round of meetings in December. We had a bunch of meetings and learned a lot from different stakeholders. So we'll give you a very quick preview of what we learned in December before we get into the guts of our discussion today, where we'll walk through an exercise that Nicole was hinting at, we walked through with other groups earlier today, and it's also the feature of tonight's LDC workshop at Fargo Cast Public Health from 5:30 to 7, hosted by the Fargo Neighborhood Coalition. So that'll be the first real public opportunity for folks to come out, learn about the project, and we'll be getting reactions to some key ideas that are at the heart of this project. So in terms of the basics, where we are here, we're still in phase 1 of this project. We launched 2 months ago in December, and this is a project that will go toward into the spring of next year, 2026. So it's a long-term project. We're still in the early innings. We're still at this phase where we're analyzing the code, analyzing policies, and beginning a process of looking at a handful of broadly representative areas throughout Fargo that will serve as these small area testing cases to put some ideas that are bubbling up to the test on the ground in specific parcels and specific neighborhoods. So that'll be taking place here in phase 1, and this will go on into the summer of this analysis work. At the same time, in phase 2, starting in April, we'll begin the process of drafting the new code. A lot of that work will really pick up in the fall and then into the winter of next year, and then resulting in the spring of 2026, a code that is ready for public review by both of these bodies, and that'll be an iterative process of fine-tuning it until it's considered final. So we're still early on here, and this week is the second round of meetings with the different groups that are part of this project. So our technical advisory committee that we met with earlier today, comprised of city engineering, city inspections, city finance, technical city staff that will be advising us throughout the process here. But today is also the start of the focus groups, or the second round of our focus groups. So we met with incentives folks earlier today. We're meeting with designers tomorrow, developers and builders tomorrow. The neighborhood folks are tonight as part of that public workshop. Routine interactions with all of you is a really important part of this process. And like I said, the general public is being brought into it officially today with that workshop at Fargo Cast Public Health. There will be about a half a dozen workshops throughout the process, and the content of each workshop will differ depending on where we are in the project. And as you'll see in a moment here, what we have queued up for tonight is starting at a high altitude to get confirmation that what the Planning Commission and City Commission approved last year in the new growth plan is truly the roadmap for drafting the new LDC. That's sort of a test that we're kind of placing on this week in our interactions with different groups and with the public tonight. So that'll be one method of engagement, the LDC workshop. That if for folks who aren't able to make it to that meeting tonight, all of the posters and an online survey will be up on the website, fargoldc.org, starting this evening, so that people can basically provide similar feedback to the content that's being presented tonight. And then the other item that'll be part of our outreach is something called Code Connect. That'll be in a kind of a live online event that we'll do once every 2 months, starting at the end of next month, where we'll have a presentation updating folks on the project, doing some educational presentations, and there can be a Q&A as part of that, just so anyone who would like to stay in the know can always hop on one of those calls to kind of see where we're at and chime in with their thoughts. So that's sort of a quick summary of where we are and the advisory pieces of this project. So what those advisory pieces taught us in December, we after getting through lots of different meetings, we identified that there were about 10 distinct issues that came up again and again. And as you see from this list, we have brackets around some of them that can be grouped, that have a lot of overlap in kind of what they're about and how they relate to the LDC. But these are issues that probably, most of you hear about on a regular basis. We've certainly heard about during the growth planning process, during the core neighborhood master planning process that we did a few years ago. So this list, we're actually going to start using to help focus our work in phase one. Because when you think about the land development code, you could be overwhelmed by, 101 different things that you could go running after trying to understand. By using the growth plan as kind of a foundation for our work, and now by having this list of issues that are really on people's minds, that getting them right will have a lot to do with whether we get the LDC right. This will really help focus our work, and you can expect as we go along here, we'll kind of come back to this list and share what we're uncovering and kind of what direction we think we're heading in when it comes to making parking a part of this modern LDC that reflects the growth plan. Same thing with historic overlays, same thing with form standards. So these will be touchstones that we'll come back to throughout the process. And something that is on our minds as we start this work is that there's a distinction to be made when it comes to thinking about the LDC as it applies to existing parts of Fargo and infill development, and how it applies to new development in greenfield areas. It'll probably be the case that many of the issues on this list will need to be calibrated slightly differently depending on what the context is, whether you're in an infill setting or if you're in designing a brand new subdivision. So kind of teasing that apart so that we understand what we're looking at, and so that those that we're talking to kind of understand, what do you mean parking, out on the green field, out on the growth grid versus parking in downtown, parking in a core neighborhood. It matters where you are and what you're talking about. So that'll be part of what we're thinking about. Mayor?
It just seems when you have landscaping as number one, is this just when you went through land development code, your team got these 10, or is it an order of priority? Because typically when we're approving something, it's the plat and where it lays out. Yeah. Landscaping is probably the last thing we look at. Mm-hmm. So is this when you look at our LDC, you say, these are the 10 areas you have to address?
No, these aren't prioritized. These are kind of the things that came up repeatedly in the meetings in December. So these aren't the only issues we'll be looking at. There are probably a lot several other issues that we'll also want to keep on the table. But this will really help focus our work and help us. The more we understand about these, the better.
I think Commissioner Strand will say, I don't like the architectural part of that. Is that the form standards, or is that's where that is?
Form.
I think the mayor thought this was like David Letterman's top 10 list, and the number one was.
That's actually a good idea for the communications team to sort of really make this, come alive at a future meeting. So that's sort of the key thing to report back from what we learned in December from all of our meetings. And again, there are other things that came up, but those are the things that came up most often, and we'll keep returning to those. So for the rest of this meeting, we'd like to go through an exercise that, like I said, is something we're doing with the public tonight, and we're doing with other stakeholders during our conversations this week. And something that we thought would be helpful, because the growth plan that was adopted last year, it's a pretty high-level conceptual document. There's a lot of theory in there about how and where Fargo should grow. But it can be kind of hard to picture, well, what does it look like to apply the growth plan through a land development code? What would that look like process-wise, and what might that look like outcome-wise? So we thought it would be helpful both for ourselves to wrap our heads around this, and for others in the community to kind of get a sense of, let's imagine it's the year 2030. And Fargo has a new land development code, and it's been applying it for a couple of years to understanding whether new development is in line with the growth plan and the LDC. It's been applying this new LDC, and 4 hypothetical projects are before the city, before the Department of Planning, and the staff are using the LDC to to figure out, is this something that should get the green light? Should they go back to the drawing board? How might this new LDC work in practice? So that's the goal of this exercise here that you have in front of you. The handout is actually exact copies of the posters that we'll be using at the public meeting tonight. So what we do at the public meeting tonight is we have a whole station of posters that lays out the foundational ideas from the growth plan as a setup for this exercise that you have in front of you. So we talk about the Fargo transect, which is the first model for practical growth from the Fargo growth plan, this idea that you have rural, suburban, urban context within Fargo, and the LDC has to be responsive to all of those different contexts, and to the fact that the vision for growth that Fargo has is to have going forward some more intense urban style development, not just in downtown, but also in defined centers outside of downtown where it can funnel some of that additional 30,000 people that the city is expected to add over the next 20 years. So the Fargo transect is an important kind of foundational piece to thinking about the direction the LDC is going. That informs this idea of place types, to get away from thinking purely about land use towards thinking about place types that are a mixture of uses that come together to create urban neighborhoods, suburban neighborhoods, mixed commercial districts. So that's another piece that's laid out for the public tonight. And then the two concepts that have to do with location of growth, the growth grid, which is the model in the growth plan that's about sequencing future growth on the edge in a organized way, and in a way that features more mixed use pedestrian scale development, so that you're still certainly growing outward, but you're doing it in a more urban and intensive way that long term is more fiscally responsible and creates stronger, more durable community types on Fargo's edge. It makes better use of the land that is now as more scarce commodity because of the diversion project. So the growth grid, and then growth centers, the idea that in addition to accommodating growth towards the edge, you're also accommodating growth in well-defined centers, which can be both within the growth grid, but also for the most part in existing parts of Fargo, where you have these different types of growth centers, regional, community, and neighborhood centers, where you would expect to see more intense redevelopment over time, residential, commercial, institutional, kind of combined into a walkable place. So these models are laid out for the public tonight in posters as a setup for the discussion that you have in front of you here, where we imagine again that it's 2030. There are these 4 proposals, 2 infill projects, 2 greenfield projects, and part of this exercise harkens back to this image from the growth plan, where we talk about a 2-test process for evaluating projects. The first test being, does a project conform with the place type that the LDC will assign to each place in Fargo? And as part of place type, that it will also lead to certain dimension requirements and development standards. So there's sort of test 1. Does a project check that box of having the right use, having the right form? If it does, it's eligible for by right approval, which means that it can happen through administrative process. And a lot of projects already happen that way in Fargo, but can happen through administrative process, doesn't have to go before the Planning Commission, doesn't have to come before a City Commission. It's a rapid, predictable way for a project that crosses all the T's to move along efficiently. And then there's a second test where you take a project that passes test 1 and you ask, is this something that the city should be investing in actively through incentives? And the second test has a couple of conditions. One being, is it in a strategic growth location? So namely, is it in a designated growth center or is it in the right part of the growth grid if it's in a greenfield area? If it checks those boxes, the other condition is there a public benefit provided? In addition to being in a strategic location, is there something that project is contributing to the development of a strong community fabric in the part of Fargo where that project is being assisted? That could be mixed income housing, it could be parkland, it could be any number of things that will be defined during this process as a relevant public benefit for different parts of Fargo. So if a project can check those boxes, what we're saying through the growth plan is that makes it eligible for incentives. At this stage, we're not talking about a very specific incentive here or there. What we're saying is think about the incentives you currently have, whether it's TIF, abatements, pilot, special assessments, there are density bonuses baked into the existing LDC. Think about those incentives as kind of a toolbox, and think about how you deliberately use that toolbox to make optimal growth happen in the right locations to bring about the right set of public benefits. So that's a very different way of thinking about how to evaluate projects going forward. By and large, but it's also something that's come up in recent conversations this morning, that it's something that, like your Renaissance zone already does. That's an incentive that is tied to a location and achieving a certain place goal, a placemaking goal. So it's not a foreign idea within Fargo, but it's different to apply this idea citywide and to think kind of about a diverse set of incentive tools to have at the ready to make certain types of growth happen in the right places. So this general idea is part of the growth plan. This is ripped right out of the growth plan. It's presented to the public tonight as a setup for this exercise of looking at these 4 projects and how the city might look at these 4 projects in 2030 using an LDC that is, a kind of a straight line from the growth plan itself. So what you have once you turn the page is kind of poster by poster. It takes you through each of these projects with a quick description. So the first 2 projects are infill development projects. And this first one is an example you can see on kind of the right margin, pointing out what are the aspects of the design of the project that are good fits for what the growth plan and then this LDC is trying to achieve in terms of quality of development, quality of materials, form within a certain place type. So pointing out how that project is getting those things right. So that's one piece of it. This is a mixed-use project that also has 3 deed-restricted workforce housing units as part of the proposal. And there are 2 location options. The developer is looking at one location that's within a designated growth center, and then another location is not in a designated growth center. But in either case, this proposal would be conforming with the place type, and it would also be meeting the dimensional requirements and development standards for that location. So that's just sort of a high-level overview of what this project is about. And then the bottom of this poster takes you through these 2 tests. And that first test, you can see that at both locations, it conforms with the place type, so it has the right uses. The uses are not contrary to what that place type is trying to be. The dimensional requirements, the development standards, it's checking those boxes. And so as a result, it's eligible for by right approval. So this project A, can go forward at either of these locations. Test 2, though, you see that only location 1 is eligible for an incentive because only that first location is within a designated growth center. They both, as part of the proposal, would provide a public benefit, this workforce housing units, but the incentive only applies to that first location for the project. So part of what we're doing during this round of meetings this week, what we'll be asking of the public tonight is, does this, does this make sense? Does this make sense based on where the growth plan was coming from? And can you support this? Is this application of the growth plan through this LDC, is this something that you think results in a fair process and a good outcome for the community, for the city of Fargo and its financial status? So that's something that we're trying to tease out of the discussions. And we've actually had some very lively discussions already today, kind of picking apart the ins and outs of kind of how these tests are applied. But that's the point of these meetings, to sort of surface the right questions and the right ideas at this stage, so that we can figure out, are we on the right track? Is sort of the growth plan kind of straight line into the LDC? Is this the right track? Or there's some important questions that we need to, ask as a team, talk to staff about, talk to you about, before we get too much further to sort of solidifying our approach to this. So before we go kind of into the other projects, does anyone have any questions or sort of comments about what you've seen so far?
I have a question. So can you talk a little bit, we have the Planning Commission here. Can you talk a little bit about how this would change how we do business? With this by right approval, can you talk about how that would change and the importance of having this land development code followed, because it changes how we would do that?
Mm-hmm. So one of the ways that that things might be different is that a lot of Fargo's best projects right now are being, they go through the conditional overlay or a planned unit development process. And that has been working pretty well in terms of getting good outcomes to come from new development. But it's not a terribly predictable process. There's a lot of negotiation and back and forth that's involved. So part of the goal with this new LDC would be to take those good outcomes and make it something that's more that's a more routine expectation, that it's that you don't have to engage in that sort of back and forth project by project. You can have those outcomes built into the underlying the base zoning citywide, and you can achieve something that right now is really being achieved by those two means through a much more streamlined process.
So can I ask, so then, like, as a developer, then if you follow all the standards that we've set, if you follow them all, then do you still go to the Planning Commission, or how will it go? Let's say if you check all those boxes, then is it automatically approved? I guess that's my question.
Yeah. No, good question. So if by right approval would mean administrative approval. So in other words, the standards that are in the book, all the rules, they met the rules, the staff determined that they meet all the rules, then it's administrative approval, and they wouldn't have to go to the Planning Commission. However, if they choose to do something different and they want to, have, if there's variances involved and things like that, then they would go through a very similar process that you have now with, a recommendation from the Planning Commission on certain things.
I have a follow-up to that, and I appreciate the predictability that this brings. It's actually a forced workflow, working with planning and developers. As part of that process, will we also be looking at efficiencies in the process itself?
Could you be more specific, like what in terms of?
I've had a couple of conversations with developers, and sometimes maybe it is the back and the forth with the city. Yeah. Maybe it's paperwork or bureaucracy, or I don't know what you want to call it, but it would be nice to be looking at streamlining it every step of the way where we can.
Yeah, I think one of the goals of this entire system is a by right system would be to streamline it and make it very transparent, very predictable, very black and white, measurable. And if they meet those standards, then they would get approval.
Mm. Yeah. And a big part of it is also kind of raising standards so that you're not just achieving those standards in those conditional overlays and PUDs. You're achieving those standards everywhere. A good base level, higher standard of design and development, across the board. And that would all be by right.
I have a question on the incentive portion. The economic development policy, so is that what drives those check boxes? So if you were, to go to the first two check boxes, you would go through that policy to make sure it does check? Is that, or how does it correlate, right?
I think, having the designation of growth centers and which growth grid is kind of an active growth grid, and which public benefits are kind of relevant for different locations. You can think about that as kind of a related policy that it could be part of the economic development policy, or it's where that might reside is unclear right now exactly what would work best, but you could picture that as something, some sort of an associated set of policies that you would review on an annual basis. This came up in our meetings earlier, like, well, how often are you considering what are your growth centers, or which growth grid is active, or which public benefits you're trying to get here versus there. Those are all things that you would want to, just like with the rest of the growth plan, if you're evaluating that every 5 years to see, are you getting what you want out of your growth plan? Same thing with your selected strategic locations and public benefits, and as well as the tools, the exact incentive tools that you want to have linked to achieving, your goals in different parts of the city. So, you can think about that at this stage as being kind of, economic development policies that are tied very closely to the LDC.
Can I ask something else on that? So the question of providing a public benefit could be different depending on which growth center we're talking about, right? And so, so the incentives, it's not a blanket effect in that sort of, it would, okay.
Yeah, you would want to tailor it so that it's effective given the location and what you're trying to achieve there. Yeah,
and part of our process will be to clarify what a public benefit is as we walk through this LDC process. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah.
I just have a comment that first of all, I appreciate personally, I appreciate the clarity of this process that you're proposing. Looking down the road, the possibility, though, that a project follows this process, and then suddenly people realize that the result is actually horrible. I mean, the advantage of discretionary decision-making is that there's some judgment involved. So what are the breaks, I guess, in terms of being able to review projects and allowing some continued discretionary decision-making so we don't get stuff that we didn't intend to get?
So that a bad project doesn't get administrative approval. That's basically it. Okay. Thomas, do you want to go?
I mean, I think I might start. I think it would be to ensure that the standards that are incorporated into the new LDC are a higher standard than what you have now. So oftentimes a project goes through review at Planning Commission as part of a PUD, conditional overlay, and they work closely with staff, they work closely with the Planning Commission, and you get things right, whether that's building form or maybe it's maybe the appearance of the building, maybe certain architecture, maybe articulation, different pieces. Maybe it's a sidewalk, maybe it's street trees, landscaping, whatever the case is. You guys kind of incrementally work through that. I think a lot of what we're talking about with the new LDC is to bake that into the code. So raise those standards, but they become very predictable. So to answer your question, if we raise those standards, it's supported by Planning Commission, the Community Planning Commission, and the commissioners, then that would become the standard. By the time that goes through the project, they'll review with staff, a developer will review with staff. If they meet that code, those higher standards, that project would be approved. So as long as we get those higher standards into the code, you shouldn't have that issue.
And
It just won't go through the same duration of project review with Planning Commission that it would with a PUD.
I'll add, Thomas, that, as we're thinking about this process, it's something that we're really careful about as we're drafting the code. We think about the spectrum of projects, and we want to get the standards right. We're going to test real projects on the ground to make sure that it is mitigating any negative outcomes, but it's remaining flexible enough to address all different kinds of contexts. And so making sure we get that spectrum right, and we're going to do a lot of on-the-ground testing to make sure that we get that. But we also are honest about the fact that cities evolve over time. So there needs to be an at least annual evaluation as projects come in, as new building technologies emerge, making sure that that spectrum is still right. And over time, there are going to have to be text amendments to the code to make sure that it's mitigating any negative outcomes. So it's really important that we test it up front, but also it is something that is continually tested and evolved as the city evolves and things change.
The deed restricted workforce housing, is that inclusionary zoning? Or how do we get there? Because we don't do that now.
No. This in this example here, this isn't presented as inclusionary zoning. It would just be that. So let's say in these locations, let's say workforce housing, something that's inclusionary. Inclusionary housing is identified as a public benefit. So that would be one way that these units would be baked into a project like this. And you could say that wouldn't represent how inclusionary zoning typically works, but you could also say this would be, inclusionary housing brought about through kind of this LDC framework. So I guess in a way, it would have the effect of inclusionary zoning. Yeah.
I'm glad to see it in there.
Yeah, it would be incentivized inclusionary housing, not mandatory, but incentivized, whether city bonus, incentives, et cetera. Yeah.
Yeah, it could be one of many benefits, public benefits that are included as part of the incentive package.
Yeah, not mandatory, but voluntary. Yeah.
Let's make it mandatory.
Going back to the idea of the higher standards, which I think are good, make sense. My concern would be higher cost, and then what impact does that have on affordability of projects? So where has this been demonstrated before to be able to keep a range of affordability options while still maintaining a high standard?
Affordability of development options for the project per se.
Yes, yeah, if we've got higher standards for it, inevitably.
So in this case, that project located in the growth center in number 1, they're working with the city to secure an incentive, right, to put in deed restricted affordable housing in this case, right? So they're running their pro forma and working with the city to understand what that difference is to do workforce housing, right? And so if that number works, if it pencils, they would move forward with it. If it didn't, they would probably simply do market rate housing. So they'll run those numbers. But we'll have to ensure that we connect the incentives to the value received as a result of, say, workforce housing. So we'll have to run those numbers.
And I think there are a couple of other things as we're thinking about higher standards. The first is that process is really expensive. Your development community is spending a lot of dollars right now just getting through the process. So predictability is going to be that is a trade-off. We're saying you have to meet higher standards, but you're going to get predictability and save costs on those soft costs up front. Also, we know that you have a lot of standards today that people are spending money on, landscaping, for example, just having to get the number of plants on the project, even though it's not the desired outcome. So it's higher standards in that we want to get better outcomes, but the cost of doing so is not going to be any different because we're just going to make sure that the standard is actually making sure the landscaping is in the right spot, that it's in the place that it's the most effective. So it's the same number of plants, it's just a better site layout. So it's going to be a combination of those things.
When it comes to public benefit, my sense is very often we easily go to where's the best return financially down the road. And I'm guessing that list of public benefits is way more than return on investment financially.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's we had some of that discussion this morning, and I think it could be a combination of things, because certainly the financial piece of it is a public benefit, but so is parks and open space or affordable housing units or whatever they might be. So it's likely to be a combination of different types of benefits, both financial as well as quality of life benefits.
Good questions. Any others?
And if you have any thoughts on, it should lean one way more than the other, then we certainly want to hear that as well.
Just going back to kind of the design standards real quick. Yes, a building could be beautiful on day one. How do we maintain that throughout the years? Is that written in any way as far as yearly maintenance or anything like that?
One thing that comes to mind, maintenance is always a tough issue, especially within a code, but I think, materials and things like that, the durability of materials over time, some of those types of things that we can certainly get into.
Yeah, probably durability materials and, making sure that you're specifying plant materials that are appropriate and make sense for the climate. You have a pretty unique climate. So I think things like that, they're softer things. They're not exactly, code enforcement, although that can also be a piece of it. Something else that we're thinking about is, how to bring nonconformities into conformance over time. So as properties may want to incrementally redevelop, how do we allow properties to develop incrementally and improve piece by piece, as opposed to saying, no, you have to scrape it and build something brand new and shiny. So how do we get those improvements over time is something we're also thinking about, and that can really help contribute to maintenance and sort of upkeep of properties.
Are there examples out there of communities? I appreciate this public standards discussion, but sometimes those standards, we could elevate them perhaps if we're properly incenting them. New additional extra standards like public art, really stepping up the materials, stepping up the visibility, stepping up those things, which we don't have any of that right now. Are there on your radar ways we can say to folks, hey, thanks for doing this project, but if you take it up to this level, we got these new incentives to encourage you and thank you for doing that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it all comes down, and this is where I think a lot of effort will have to go into thinking really consciously about the growth centers and what you're trying to achieve. Like you don't just ideally in like 20 years you don't just have like these cookie cutter growth centers where that all feel kind of the same. They all feel like mixed use little nodes that aren't really differentiated from each other. So I think part of what goes into the growth center planning is thinking about what about a specific growth center, how does a specific growth center add to Fargo's kind of portfolio of places that make it more competitive and compelling as a place for people to live and to open a business. And so you might have a growth center where you want to emphasize public art and really high quality public spaces. And you might need to have certain tools that help to make those public benefits materialize through private investment. You might have another public or growth center where you really want to put an emphasis on institutions locating there, kind of co-locating and kind of playing off of one another, whether they're educational or museums or something. You want to create some sort of a cultural or innovation destination or something like that. I think part of some of the fun when it comes to thinking about what are you trying to achieve where you have this more intense urban form, that I think that will really determine what are the public benefits you're trying to create there, and how do they create something distinct and different. I think that'll be an important goal that the Planning Commission can.
And I'll be quick and won't belabor this, but in as much as you have beauty and art and enhancements, you also have historic preservation, which is beautiful to many people. So I'd like to make sure that's on our radar as well, in our thinking of what's beauty and what's enhancements and what's value.
Mm-hmm. I think an important part of the public benefit discussion will be identifying what those public benefits are. And there are ways that even in the LDC that we can start to incentivize some of those things by, making it easier to renovate historic buildings with some standards, or with public open space, letting that count towards your stormwater requirements. So there are ways that in the code we are encouraging that type of public benefit, in addition to this test 2 of having public benefit that would be an incentive. So we're thinking about that in both ways. And so as we're thinking of those lists, and we would love you all's feedback as you think through these ideas of, not only how do we get incentive dollars out there, but also how are we making it really easy in the code and incentivizing it for you to do these things.
And I'll stop, but we need some teeth in our preservation policies. We don't have any teeth. And people can go do what they want, and we just sit there, okay. But taking historic relevant buildings and turning them into parking lots has to stop. And we've had way too much of that.
I think part of with historic preservation and the historic overlays are on that top 10 list, so we're definitely looking into that. And I think with that issue, an important part of this process will be identifying what is realistic for the LDC to accomplish in pursuit of historic preservation, but what is it? But recognizing that the LDC can only go so far, and what else does Fargo need, especially when it comes to incentives? I think a lot of the good that happens with historic preservation in many communities comes from the right combination of restrictions to make sure that an asset doesn't get needlessly demolished, but also incentives that actually make it feasible for the private sector to do something with a building that is, presents some serious financial obstacles to storing. So I think it's identifying that right balance, not just of what can the LDC do, but what other tools do you need to make that happen?
Sorry, I was just going to add a couple things. First of all, I'm going to put on my arts and culture hat for a moment. I want to make sure, too, that we're really thinking about the integration of arts and culture throughout all of our areas of town, and not just in specific growth centers or the most urban areas. We really need to kind of change our mindset about how that really could be celebrated everywhere. Everyone deserves access to it. The second thing is, I'm an architect. I have been for 30 years, worked all over the U.S. I really respectfully say our standards right now are pretty low. So when we talk about raising the bar, I know the first thing everyone gets concerned with is what's it going to cost? Because that's real, right? And my clients are developers. They care. If I didn't care about this, I'd be out of a job real quick. But there are so many, there are incredibly, incredibly beautiful, impactful buildings that are extraordinarily inexpensive. It's just somebody really intentionally thought about the design. There are really big, elaborate, extraordinarily expensive buildings that are hideous. So when we talk about elevating our standards, I think we just have to be really thoughtful of what are we trying to do, right? It's not about more money. We can elevate our standards by talking even about paint colors. Maybe we don't have to have a new apartment complex that has one paint color. God forbid we could have 2 or 3, right? I mean, there's simple things that we could really introduce that could just change the dialogue in a very meaningful way, but simple. So I just don't want to get hung up on only the cost conversation, but what's the impact that we can have? Because if we focus on impact, I feel like then we're starting to create a different narrative that's meaningful for our citizens. Thanks.
No, thank you. We've covered, I think, great conversation, covering a lot of great territory here. I just wanted to go on to Project B here, which I think will surface maybe some other additional potentially helpful kind of side conversations, because this is a little more challenging in terms of what's good, what's potentially bad. So this is also an infill development project. You can see kind of the the form issues that are identified on the right-hand side in the margins there, this is, a pretty presentable looking mixed-use building. There are some issues in terms of the setback and buffer with the adjacent residential structure. You have setback from the street with parking in front, no sidewalk. So there are a couple of kind of no-nos when it comes to form here. This is also in a location that is a designated growth center. So it has a strategic location. It has some form notes that you see, that in this hypothetical example, staff have sort of made note of. And then as you move to the two tests, you see how the LDC might process this. So for that first test, might conform with the place type in terms of the mixture of uses planned for that property, but kind of the associated dimensional requirements and development standards, it has some deficiencies. So it doesn't get a yes check mark. There are some room for improvement there. So in this scenario, this is not a project that is eligible for by right approval, and it is sent back to the developer with some notes to help them, send something back that would be a better fit for its location. And as a result of that, test 2 doesn't really apply yet. If something doesn't pass test 1, test 2 isn't really in play. But you can see that it is in a growth center. So if it were to come back and check that first box, then it would have to identify some public benefit in order to potentially be eligible for an incentive. So this is a slightly different situation, and you see kind of how the two tests here apply. Any thoughts or questions as you kind of look at the details of a project like this and some of the deficiencies that are identified and how the process looks at this? Any thoughts?
Maybe the dumbest question in the world, but we've accommodated parking underground lately more and more. How about roofs and turning roofs into green spaces and things there? Some communities doing some really interesting things with roofs. And I don't know if we're even talking roofs or not. I don't know.
It's probably one of those things you could think about down the road as something you want to incentivize. It's not easy to require based on International Building Code IBC, but it's something you could certainly incentivize.
If something is not eligible for by right approval, is there a way for a developer to protest that then? Or is it just the comments are handed back to them and they need to change their whatever?
So for by right approval, they would have to meet the standards, the requirements set in the LDC. So they would have to, in this case, they would have to take the project back, look where they do not meet the code. For example, building setback, parking was supposed to be off to the side or behind, et cetera. They would have to meet that and then come back in for approval. If they didn't do that, they would have to, they could request a variance, prove a hardship in front of the zoning board, but that would be a hardship that they would have to prove.
But she brings up a good point, because we had a development in which the building was in the front and they built the new building behind, so it set it back. So all the parking's in front.
Mm-hmm.
So the question, Nicole, would that, if we did the new LDC, been approved? We would say, tear that building out first and build it up front and put the parking in back. I'm talking about where Dwayne's Pizza is on University. If we've had a strict LDC code, would have that one failed?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to talk about real exact specifics at this high-level time period, but I think it all depends on where it's located, right? And so I think I like this exercise because it's a little bit of a test. It's probably more typical what we're dealing with. And maybe to answer Amy's question too on by right, I just lost it. But I think it's no different than what you would normally see as a site plan. And so if, at some point you're still having to meet the setback, if you submit a site plan today, whether you need a zoning change or not, you get through those entitlements. You're now at the permit level. You're still having to meet the setbacks and the dimensional standards. And so I think that what they're meaning by right is that's already standardized so that if you look at the previous exercise, our technical staff group, we're looking at project type A before. We have examples of those, say, on veterans. And those projects went through, I can't tell you how many months through Planning Commission of overlays and PUDs or zoning and minor plats, major plats, amendments, and so it's those kinds of, they could, I think if that met all these standards, it could be through in a normal 2-week permit process as opposed to 120 days or 240 days of process. So I think those appeals would still be variances, appeals, those tools for someone to like push that envelope. They still could.
Sure, thank you, that helps, more streamlined, like Commissioner Colbeck, so.
I apologize, I have to go now, but thank you for this great discussion. I just want to make a couple closing comments. The first is how important the community inputs continues to be in this process, and so I hope people remain really engaged as this work continues, because what we're really talking about, if done right and done well, is the next exciting version of Fargo, right? And so it's really important that we hear from people. So thank you.
Thank you.
And then maybe to answer Mayor's question on this, like this project development B, assuming, so sidewalks today are required by code. So this, we're not going backwards in pedestrian access in my mind, but in terms of setbacks, like this setting might be appropriate in somewhere in one of our greenfield areas, but like on Broadway, we wouldn't see this proposal, right? And so it's all, that's where that place type gets really specific.
So then I have a question on by right. If this didn't go through, they asked for a variance, then that's what would come to our commission then. Because if it didn't get approved by right, or they wanted to make a change or request a variance, that's what we could expect to see?
Possibly. It depends on, normally that would be the Board of Adjustment.
Oh.
And so this would be more like zoning changes if they wanted to change your place type designation. So we'll still need to map all that out on how process changes works. Like,
sure.
So.
Yeah, that's one thing that we'll have to kind of flesh out as we go through, because there sometimes could be a building that, geez, like, wow, everybody really, it's a signature building. Maybe it's a little bit different. Maybe it doesn't meet the standards, to the letter. But having a process to approve those projects is something that we're also cognizant of.
And then I assume as you build this, you're going to test maybe some old, maybe TIF projects and some new ones to see how they're going to flush out. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Following up on John Strand's comment, actually, I'm also very interested in architectural quality and preserving our historic neighborhoods. I noticed that both of the projects here that are infill development are really large scale. That is compared to a lot of what is happening in the older neighborhoods of Fargo, where a single lot is infill development, sometimes to the detriment of the entire neighborhood, and sometimes not. But I would hope that you would also develop a scenario for very small interventions that can be really important.
Yeah, fair point. Yeah.
I think if I could add just one thing to that, one thing that I think is really going to help that, and we're thinking about in the future, right now your code really treats everything the same. So if you're residential and your greenfield is treated the same as if you're in a historic neighborhood. And what we're really thinking about is you need a different set of tools for that. For an infill scenario that is a single lot embedded in a neighborhood that may be a historic neighborhood, from what you need if you're platting out a residential subdivision. So we're really thinking about, both from a residential perspective and all the way up to a mixed use, more intense perspective, what those different tools need to look like in different areas. And the place types is really going to help us work through that.
Okay. just, get through these other ones kind of, we could probably faster since we've covered a lot of the kind of themes that you'll see in these last two ones as well, even though these are shifting from infill to greenfield. So the growth grid kind of becomes a consideration here. So this is kind of a large-scale mixed-use project. Similar to Project A, there are two potential locations. One location is in a part of the growth grid that is considered active in 2030. It's actively growing, so it's a strategic location. The second location is a mile beyond the development edge in the growth grid, so it's not considered an active growth grid. But in both locations, it conforms with the place type and with dimensional requirements and development standards. This one includes, as a public benefit, a small park. And then, so how this is considered by this process, again, kind of the two locations, place type conform, it sort of hits the kind of the right form notes. So it's a yes for by right approval in both locations. But again, when it comes to test two, the incentive in kind of along the lines of the growth plans guidance only applies to location one. Something that came up in an earlier meeting that's important to note here is that if special assessments are considered part of a toolkit of incentives, that means that only special assessments would only become a part of a project at location one. It would only be an aid in terms of helping to finance infrastructure for a project at location one, not at location two. So part of how this system would work is you would say, this is a good project, this in terms of, being good form, being, appropriate to place type. And if the developer wants to proceed at location two, fine, but the city isn't involved in terms of incentives. So it would be on the developer to build out all of the infrastructure on their own and not have the city build out and finance the infrastructure for them as part of the special assessment system. So that would be that's sort of the key difference to understand as part of this scenario here. Again, the green light at either location, but incentives only at the one that is in the active growth grid.
Just another box to check as we look at options going forward would be public transit. Transit-informed development is critical in the future. We can't overlook transit, whatever it'll look like down the road.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's where the growth centers are such an important part of not only creating kind of the walkable mixed-use centers, but creating places where transit is viable, where it sort of creates demand for alternative transportation. Yeah.
The one thing you're talking about there, it would be a huge change because right now our specials are across the board. And to now, we would be considering specials an incentive, and it would be targeted. And so I think that it'll be, and we didn't have anything thrown today at the earlier meetings, so that was a good indicator. But this would be a drastic change for developers, especially. Right now, we give them across the board. And so I just think that's something for everyone to be aware of. I think this is a great thing because we're actually using it as a tool. And that's what it should have been at the beginning. So if you don't mind giving a little bit of conversation about that, because it's a big deal. Thank you.
Yeah, it's not something to paper over. It would be a change, and that's why it's important to bring it up early in the project so that everyone can kind of weigh that as kind of a shift that is that appropriate? Should that be part of the thinking going forward, or I think that's a good point.
Well, one of the benefits of this that came up through the growth planning process is, as our city engineer, I know the Planning Commission doesn't get to see our city engineer as often as maybe back when we used to have informational meetings more often, but they're working on a 5-year, even 10-year CIP, and so every time a development comes forward and they're having to breakneck change their planning as folks that are in the construction industry, you just can't like wheel the ship that fast. And so it's good, just community-wide conversation on planning and strategically thinking through where we're investing infrastructure. And it's a real change in permitting and development processes. And so that's something we don't want to hide the ball. We want to have that conversation. We do have the meetings tomorrow, which things might get thrown at us, but we'll see.
Yeah, the one thing I'll add to that is that, we work in a lot of different places, and it's very unusual, to say the least, in terms of how it's been currently administered in the city of Fargo when it comes to the specials.
You're not testifying in court, but can I just ask, how many other cities do you know of that do specials the way we do?
I don't know of any personally.
So I'm just saying, from our perspective as citizens of Fargo, we maybe need to start looking at this, because if we're the only ones doing it in the entire country, we might want to change what we're doing. Thank you.
Help me understand the elephant in the living room that we're dancing around. We're talking about greenfield expansion now to the edge and the use of specials to where right now we fund them, we bond and fund for the developers. Help me understand the material changes rather than just kind of sensing something's changing.
Can you take that? Right now, the way it's working is the city is assuming that risk of that cost. More often, what's the case in other communities is the developers paying for that infrastructure. And then that cost then gets shifted to, the eventual owners or renters of that. So they're assuming the risk up front. So, part of the reason why we've been talking about this being an important change really comes down to fiscal health for the city. Public dollars are not finite, and it's a cost to the city to assume that risk and to pay for that infrastructure. And you have to maintain that infrastructure in the long run. And so it's just making sure that as you have a finite amount of public dollars, that you're thinking about the responsibility in the long term and making sure that those dollars are there when you need them, and they're in the places where make the most sense for the good of the community at large.
And what we're also talking about is $500 million worth of debt the city is carrying, which puts us at risk financially if times change. But, that's a reality that people need to understand. We've got a lot of debt the city is carrying to carry these special developments along. Big change.
I just have a general note that when it comes to looking at public benefit, everyone is going to have a different definition of what that means. And so I don't have a suggestion. I'm just saying it's going to be very important to figure out how to balance that per place type and growth area, whatever. So that's it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an important conversation. Very. Okay. The last project here, and this will feel a little bit similar to Project B, but this is also a greenfield development where it is in the right sequence in terms of the growth grid. It's retail with some office use. You see kind of the issues noted on the right in terms of the parking situation, the pole sign, the landscaping. There are kind of a variety of things pointed out there. It's kind of more of an old school style commercial plaza. And as you see, kind of how the LDC would evaluate this. And this is a project you might have seen like 30 years ago or something like that. So this is, kind of an example to bring up just to really underscore what's sort of what this LDC would be looking at from a forum and development standards standpoint, and to again reinforce the importance of looking at these two different tests. So test one, it would not be eligible for by right approval because it's not the right standard. And as even though it would pay taxes and it would provide X number of leasable storefront spaces that could have restaurants and dry cleaners and any number of things that could be useful to the community that develops in this growth grid, it's not the right standard. And so there's a certain bright line there that's drawn for test one in that regard. And again, it does not, that means that test two isn't really relevant until test one is readdressed. And even though it is in a kind of the right spot in the growth grid there, there isn't yet a public benefit provided. So that would also have to be addressed, even if the form deficiencies were rectified. So that's the last of the projects. Any other kind of thoughts or comments now that you've seen all four of them? Anything else sort of come to mind issue-wise? As we kind of reach the end of this exercise.
So I apologize for bringing up all the unpleasant topics, but can you talk about the growth centers and how those are designated? Because I think that's a very important topic, and especially with how will the Planning Commission and Planning Department be involved in that? Because just my editorial comment is wherever that we designate growth centers, that's going to impact the value of that property. And so whoever decides that, it's a very important decision. There's going to be multiple ones and they will change over time, but how that's determined is very important, that that's a public thing and is done so everyone knows what's going on. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So that if anyone looks in the growth plan that was adopted last year, there is a map that is a set of potential growth centers. So it's not the concrete list of what the growth centers are, but it was an exercise in taking the three types of centers: regional, community, and neighborhood, and identifying locations that would have scale and kind of parcel sizes and kind of that they might have the right setup to become centers of that kind. Thomas, do you want to kind of touch on some of the underlying thinking that went into just identifying potential centers, which can inform kind of the actual process of designating, as we go forward?
Yeah, so as Pete noted, this is identifying the exact centers, parcel boundaries, et cetera, will be something that we do as part of this process with the LDC. But initially, in terms of centers identification, what we really started looking at were areas that were somewhat, had some existing viability in terms of commercial uses. They were already kind of serving as a center or a de facto center, or they had been maybe a previous center and had started to exhibit signs of blight or potential need or opportunity for redevelopment. So both of those were taken into account. Some of the other components that we looked at were rooftops within a specific radius around a center, depending if it was a neighborhood center, commercial, or regional center. That radius was bigger for each one consecutively. And the other component was street classification typology. And so all of those were taken into consideration.
And I would just add, also diversion and flood constraints were also, so I would say in the growth plan today is our place type map with neighborhood center and growth centers located, and they're just kind of bullseyes. And as we get into like the end step of this would be zoning and confirming those place types. But I think hopefully this would be the time, through that public process and through discussion, it shouldn't be a big surprise where these growth centers are. I think up by NDSU, downtown, down by Sanford Hospital, Urban Plains, they do correlate with the catalyst sites of the Go 2030. So it's kind of where activity already is. and/or plan to be. I think the debatable areas might be in the what I would call the super green fields as you get north towards 76 and 100th Avenue and the arterials through there. That might be somewhat subjective still, but the good news is I guess we're still not there yet, and there's still more to come through in terms of master planning those areas and annexation planning of those areas.
Can I just jump in real quick? But it's very important that we get those on the board, because once the diversion is done, which is now 2 years away, we are going to get unbelievable pressure. We already are, but you have to have a vision for that, because if you don't, it'll just get away from us. And so that's why having this done on the books before that happens is very important.
Is there any consideration for any additional kinds of overlays? I think of like interstate. So often, like I've worked in a lot of towns where there are complete guidelines just along all of the planning and zoning around interstates. And that's why some communities, when you drive in, it's like, wow. And I feel like we have a missed opportunity right now that we could maybe course correct in the future. So is that something being talked about?
So it's something that we can certainly look into. I think that we tend to try to stay away from overlays if we can. Christy can speak to this probably more, but defining the right district, the zoning designation for those areas, absolutely. Again, changing that form a bit, maybe that signage pattern, et cetera, you can start to make a big difference.
Are there issues like, for example, that we could be interacting or intersecting with, like opportunity zones, hub zones, federal designations? Will they influence, how will they influence us, the ones we have now or may have come our way?
Well, like opportunity zones, for example, are federal economic dollars, tax dollars, obviously, right? And so I think that certainly they can influence where we may have zoning designations. They wouldn't be a part of the code. They're a completely separate part of the work that we're doing, but they could provide outside incentives for development and redevelopment in some areas.
And my thinking is just so the left hand and the right hand are talking, so we don't have some surprise come with a federally enhanced incented project that doesn't fit our vision.
No, we'll certainly take those into account, absolutely, especially when we look at commercial and mixed-use development opportunities.
Two questions on incentives. Just one, to confirm that my assumption is right, that the greater public benefit, would there be a scale then to the greater potential incentive?
Say that one more time.
Would there be a scale for greater public incentive leading to greater public benefit leading to greater incentive?
So if somebody provides a greater public benefit or more density that's appropriate and or desired, could there be greater incentives? Yeah, I think that could probably be scaled. That's something we'll have to look at. But yeah, I would think so, yeah.
Okay.
And I think it would be, yeah, I think that would be proportional to a project. That makes sense.
Okay. And then is there opportunity for the Planning Commission to have any role in that incentive process? Would that help create any level of consistency in all of these tests and application?
Yeah, I think so. So maybe this is a good segue into our previous meetings real quick. Since we have you here and I'm on a mic. But, meeting with the EDIC and the Renaissance Zone, that's really the huddle before this, looking at that. That's really the incentives focus group. And those are, of course, public. But a couple things we heard from there is, from that group was this idea of a checklist or, there's going to be, like, to Amy's point, several different public benefit based on what you're trying to do in that geography. And there's some that are going to be universal, but really having kind of like a checklist, if you will, or an evaluation tool. Renaissance Zone, again, is another, it's kind of nice that we have that and we know how it works. And that, the Renaissance Zone has a set boundary. That boundary can change over time, but there's an evaluation. Staff presents that evaluation. The Renaissance Zone looks at that. But over time, there's some practices with that. So I think there's some examples of things like that where not every project's going to have all the things. And so how do you prioritize different elements? The other thing that I'll say, since we have this project 4 type that the focus group was talking about, is thinking about what's maybe I liked how some of the members said this, looking the context of what's there today and is what's being proposed that improvement, and so as we think about potential blight or other elements, there's that mindset, I guess historically of, what's better today is, and so I think that's going to be the crux in front of the Planning Commission and the City Commission and the public at large is what's good enough to meet standards today versus what do you want to hang on to, because there's only a finite amount of land and money, and so, or then what do you want to hang on to for future wealth? So it's a little bit, I was mentioning to the mayor, so we have the finance director and the planning director flanking the mayor in our previous meeting, influencing him. It's kind of like, do you want a consistent 3% growth, or do you want to save for a future 17% growth? And so it's really understanding how the financial piece tells the future story when it comes to the financial practices for the city of Fargo. So that's all going to have to tie in, which is why these guys are hired as part of the consultant team. So
there's a lot of shift across the country in certain places where commercial properties are being converted to housing and strip malls and things like that. How do we address that shift when it starts happening more, or do we anticipate it, and how do we make sure it's done right? And or when we have current planning now that it's allowing the next phases down the road, which may be natural or not?
Should we take it? You got it. One thing is just making sure that in the places it makes sense that you're actually allowing for that housing. In a lot of communities, it may be a not allowed use, or it's a use that requires some sort of discretionary special use permit or something like that. So if it's in an area where it's a strip mall today, but it may make sense to have housing in the future, as we're writing the zoning district for that area, let's make sure that housing is an allowed use. It's a pretty straightforward change. And then as far as the standards, it's just making sure that in that district, if that project were to be built, making sure the building is in the right place, that, we've got green space, landscaping, whatever those elements are of design, making sure that we have those in place as well, and it would work for a housing development.
And the only thing I'll add is that, just designing buildings that can actually be repurposed and used for other things without being locked in for the life of that building to what the original use was initially. And I think that happens, especially with a lot of the chain buildings that you see, and we all can name a few that we can go out there today, and they're no longer that time has passed, but everybody can look at that building and say exactly what it used to be. So getting away from that as much, I think, as possible, and building buildings that will withstand the test of time, I think is going to be important too.
Strategies around parking, allowing shared parking and uses. Parking is a huge use of land. It takes a lot of space. And so as you're thinking about these mixes of developments, being smart about those things.
Yeah, and I think the mixing of uses as well, permitting, I think that goes to what Christy was originally saying, is providing some flexibility in terms of use. There are a lot of uses that we didn't think were compatible, when we originally built cities, but I think over the years we've learned that there's a lot of uses that work just fine together, and they could share parking and resources.
Okay, I'll ask my last question. What's your biggest fear? What's your biggest advice to electeds to don't do this? I mean, we have this whole process unfold, and then all of a sudden some politicians turn everything upside down. What's your biggest fear or guidance or advice so we don't just upend this down the road and gut it with momentary decisions, like annexing or doing something very different than what's allowed? Or
That's a tough one. I think I would start out by saying that recognizing that change is not necessarily something to be feared, but it's an opportunity. I think I would start to think of this as an opportunity. And I think Dave noted that the issue relative to specials is a big shift, right? But it's a positive shift. It's a real opportunity for you guys to recognize the opportunity and an ability to truly partner with developers, right? Right now, it's been relatively responsive. Somebody comes in, they want to do it, you essentially pretty much offer it, right? And so this is an opportunity to truly say, this is a partnership and this is where we want to go, because it is going to be important moving forward to tie physical growth to fiscal growth. And I think noting that it's a positive, despite a change, I think if you can go down that path, I think you'll benefit.
I would add, I think the growth plan provides, I think, sound, long-term guidance for what, which port you want to steer your ship into. And I think if as, we go through this LDC process and we get to the final product, we have to ask ourselves collectively, is this putting that ship in the right direction? And then every project that gets evaluated through the lens of the new LDC, you got to obviously think about the project in its own merits, but you have to think, how does this project contribute to that outcome of steering Fargo into that port 20 or 30 years down the line? So I think that's a kind of always keeping that in mind and always having that kind of center your discussions around kind of day-to-day issues and kind of the immediate things that land on your desks can help avoid the kind of the occasional distractions where something comes along and you lose sight of, wait a second, what are we trying to accomplish here? Which is easy to do. Something new happens and you put so much effort into understanding that one thing that you kind of forget to step back and think about what outcomes are you trying to achieve and how does that fit into your overarching goal. So I think if the growth plan can continue to provide that guidance, I think, and you sort of are deliberate about making sure that it does, that can help you prevent that sort of pitfall.
I think that was my last note, is that this has really opened my eyes to the importance of defining the goals per growth grid, realistic goals, and just making sure that that's how we steer. So thank you.
Yeah. I have one final comment too.
Yeah.
So today we focused, very heavily on kind of our commercial side of things. Is there the same amount of work being put into single-family residential type neighborhoods? We haven't really heard anything about that, that sector yet. And just kind of re-looking at some of the developers on the residential side, how can we in the future avoid house A, B, C design neighborhoods? The cookie cutter that we kind of talked about earlier with commercial. Is that being looked at as well through this?
It is. Thinking about good subdivision standards is absolutely part of this process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the difference between, I think this is going to be a theme throughout, is the difference between infill and greenfield. There's a big difference there, even when it comes to residential development.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that will be a later meeting then, same kind of process as this meeting today. We'll look at residential as well.
Might not be in the same format, but we'll definitely be looking at that.
Yeah.
Another meeting.
Yeah.
You can anticipate something like that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. It's 4:30, so just a really quick overview of next steps. Our goal is to take all of the discussions, including the great one that we've had right now, to help us inform our sense of where this project is going, and again, how to what extent is the community, behind using the growth plan as kind of the very clear direction for shaping the new LDC. We'll be starting this process of identifying and looking at these small areas to test ideas for the LDC. this week, and that'll take us into the summer, really. So as we meet with you in the future, you'll be hearing about our work on that front. And our next round of meetings here in Fargo is likely to be at some point in May. So I imagine that will include more interactions with both of these bodies, and you'll kind of hear what we've been up to, and we'll be looking forward to taking something like this. I think there will be another LDC workshop around that time, so there'll be more exercises that we'll have designed for the public at that point. All right. Thank you very much. We appreciate your time. Yeah.